So I asked Chelsea if I could do the Time for All Ages today. And this is actually a story that I have shared probably at least twice. So for those of you that have been here for a long time, you've probably heard this story. But I just think it's a good story to I like sharing this story occasionally because it helps us reframe a little bit of what's going on and how we might be in this world that at times seems so kind of crazy and chaotic and angry and hateful and scared. This is just a reminder that there is a better way. So this story comes from Jack Kornfield, and I believe it was from the book After the Ecstasy, the Laundry. He writes, once on the train from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, Jack sat next to an African-American man who had a rehabilitation program for juvenile defenders. Most of the youth he worked with were gang members who had committed homicide. The man told him this story. One 14-year-old boy had shot and killed an innocent teenager to prove himself to his gang. At the trial, the victim's mother sat impassively silent until the end, when the youth was convicted of the killing. After the verdict was announced, she stood up slowly and looked directly at him and stated, "I'm going to kill you." Then the youth was taken away to serve several years in the juvenile facility. After the first half year, the mother of the slain child went to visit his killer. He had been living on the streets before the killing, and she was the only visitor he'd had. For a time they talked, and when she left, she gave him some money for cigarettes. She started step by step to visit him more regularly, bringing food and small gifts. Near the end of his 3-year sentence, she asked him what he would be doing when he got out. He was confused and uncertain, so she offered to set him up with a job at a friend's company. Then she inquired about where he would live, and since he had no family, she offered him temporary use of the spare room in her home. For 8 months, he lived there, ate her food, and worked at the job. Then one evening, she called him into the living room to talk. She sat down opposite him and waited. Then she started. "Do you remember in the courtroom when I told you I was going to kill you?" "I sure do," he replied. "Well," she went on, "I did not want the boy who could kill my son for no reason to remain alive on this earth. I wanted him to die. That's why I started to visit you and bring you things. That's why I got you the job and let you live here in my house. That's how I set about changing you. And that boy, he's gone. So now I want to ask you, since my son is gone and that killer is gone, if you'll stay here. I've got room, and I'd like to adopt you if you let me." And she became the mother of her son's killer, the mother he never had.
Everyone has a choice. We're either full of love or full of fear. Albert Einstein.
I see to let go. Put the past behind you, trust me, I know. Ghosts will try to find you, but just put those colors on, girl. Come and paint the world with me tonight. Come and paint the world with me tonight.
So I invite us just to take a moment within ourselves, within the comfort of our own homes, a moment of gratitude, to just take a few deep breaths, to think about what it is, even in these crazy times, we're completely grateful for. I'm grateful for this community. I'm grateful that I get to see all of these beautiful faces every Sunday morning. And I'm so grateful for the continued love and support of this community, even though we're not together in person, that this group of people is doing amazing things, and we can do that because you guys are still sharing your time, your talent, and your treasure with us. So I just, I thank you for this community and the continued support that we all share with each other in the form of our time, talent, and treasure. So I'm going to transition now into my sermon. This, like the story that I shared a few minutes ago, I have given this sermon one other time. I think it was about 2 years ago. And so some of you have probably heard it, and some of you have probably heard me talking about some of the themes in it. But in this crazy time leading up to the election, I think it's always nice to take some time to think about what's going on and maybe try to understand it from a different perspective or from a spiritual perspective. And so what I'm sharing today is not new, but it might be new for some of you, and it's good for me to think about it. So have you ever used the phrase, he or she just doesn't get it? Or we're not on the same wavelength? Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt comfortable with somebody, or somewhat repelled? Or have you found yourself thinking the words, oh, that resonates with me? For the last 2 years, I've been trying so hard to understand what is going on in our country. And I've been trying to figure out how Donald Trump got elected, why millions of people still support him. And I was trying to really understand what's going on in this world and to make sense of it, not only from a sociological or a psychological perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective. And so as I was preparing for my sabbatical a few years ago, I started coming across readings and concepts and books that were making sense to me, and my world paradigm began to change as the scientific and the spiritual began to merge together for me. And so I wrote and shared this sermon with all of you, like I said, about 2 years ago. And in light of everything that's still happening in the world, I want to share it again because I believe it is still and perhaps even more relevant now, 2 years later. So as I said, some of you have already heard me talk about this, but there are probably a number of you who haven't. So I want to share it again to give us something to think about and then to talk about as we attempt to make sense of this crazy pandemic, riot, protest, election world right now. So According to a psychologist named David Hawkins, who has his PhD in the field of consciousness, our bodies are unconscious antennas, and we are always picking up on subtle energetic cues that our conscious minds have no awareness of. And he believes that we can access this unconscious awareness through what he calls behavioral kinesiology calibrations. And over the course of about 20 years and working with thousands of people, Hawkins has come up with what he calls the map of human consciousness. And I want to share this with you today. This is his map of human consciousness. And this chart, as you can see, it is a chart that goes from 1 to 1,000 that looks at different frequency levels and equates them with different levels of human emotions and human understanding. This map begins at 20, which represents the frequency of shame, and goes all the way up to the highest level of 1,000, which represents the frequency of unconditional love, Christ consciousness, the consciousness of Buddha and Krishna. And according to Hawkins, we are all vibrating at some level of consciousness. And we can understand that when we begin to understand this map of consciousness, we can then begin to understand ourselves a little bit better. So I'm going to stop sharing that and try to find my sermon again. But what he's saying is that we are all vibrating, and it helps us make sense of this crazy world. And the way that he figured out this map of consciousness was that he did muscle testing, and he says that initially the most striking findings of kinesiology was a clear demonstration that our muscles instantly become weak when the body is exposed to harmful stimuli. And it goes strong with beneficial stimuli. And in his book, Power versus Force, he has come up with these calibrations and the scientific methodology behind his research. And so while I find that research fascinating in and of itself, that's not what I want to focus on today, because that would take up my entire sermon. But what I want to focus on this morning is the emotional, physical, and spiritual ramifications of his research. So he says on our scale of consciousness, there are two critical points that allow for major advancement. The first is at 200, and that is the initial level of empowerment. And what he says here is that here the willingness to stop blaming and accept responsibility for one's own actions, feelings, and beliefs arise. As long as cause and responsibility are projected outside of oneself, one will remain in the powerless mode of victimhood. The second level is the 500 level, which is reached by accepting love and non-judgmental forgiveness as a lifestyle, exercising unconditional kindness to all persons, things, and events without exception. So his premise is that anything over 200 is life-affirming, and under 200 is life-denying. And this is where we see the difference between power, which is innate and internal, versus force, which is always external. And if we look at the events, for example, let's take Hurricane Florence that happened a few years ago. And we see these pictures of neighbors coming together to save one another, people getting out in their boats and going out to rescue the animals. And we hear the strong convictions of, we will rebuild. We are a community. We see things like this happen, and we see people living into that power of unconditional love, of putting other people first. And we see that and we are inspired and we can almost feel our hearts opening. And usually when we have these hurricanes or major disasters, then we also see other pictures of people looting, of companies deciding that they might be able to make a profit by charging $10 for a bottle of water. And we look at them and we say to ourselves, what are they thinking? And we're literally, at least I am, we're literally repelled by them. And so according to this map of consciousness, Hawkins would say people are simply acting out of their frequency. So we see, for instance, that a person in grief, which calibrates at a low level of 75, will be in a much better condition if he rises to anger, which calibrates at 150. Now, anger itself is still a destructive emotion and a low state of consciousness, but as social history shows, apathy can imprison an entire subculture as well as individuals. And so if you can get out of the apathy into the anger, you are at a higher level and you can start creating action. So if the hopeless can come to want something better, which is desire at 125, and then use the energy of anger at 150 to develop pride at 175, they may then be able to take the step to courage, which calibrates at 200, and proceed to improve their individual or collective conditions. And I've been really fascinated with this concept because I very much, as I think most of us are, have been affected by the current events in this country for the last many years. And every day we turn on the news with boggled reporters saying, this is unprecedented. We've never seen anything like it. And I've had so many conversations with friends and family, so many of you just wondering, what is going on? And how can something that is so clear to me and so obvious be so not clear to other people? And I've said it a few times, it's almost like we're living in different universes with totally different understandings of ultimate reality. And I didn't think it could happen, but this year, that divide has just gotten bigger with the pandemic and the protests and the riots. And now, just in the last week, there's literal violence between the right-wing white supremacist groups and some of the anarchists. And they're starting to shoot each other. And with the election and the fear that the results won't be accurate, this country is even more divided now than it was 2 years ago, and I didn't think that was even possible. So what helps me make sense of all of this is looking at this from this energetic level, what I think was happening at the beginning of the summer when the Black Lives Matter protests happened. If you think about, I was part of a lot of them. I know a number of you were actually organizing them and part of them, and we had these conversations and people were saying, you know what, it's a little bit scary, but I'm gonna show up and I'm gonna risk, I'm gonna put on a mask and I'm gonna go out there because this is something I'm willing to stand up and speak up for. And that, if you think about that from this frequency level, that was coming, I believe, a lot, so many of these protests were coming from a place of power, the higher levels of compassion, of love, of empathy, of saying, we have our power, we're gonna start using our voice, right? But then what happens is that at the same time, you have these people finding their voices and speaking out, and these beautiful marches and these vigils and this demonstration of community connection. Then you have these other people that are coming way down here, and they're bringing in the anger and the hate and the fear. And all of a sudden, you have these people that are coming to this higher level of protests, and they're coming with their bats and they're slamming windows and they're starting fires. And I think a lot of them, most of them, I think, were not part at all of the Black Lives Matter protesters. They were part of this other group that was just wanting to create chaos. But then what happens, because you have these different kind of levels of consciousness all in the same place at the same time, it appears like it's just chaos and riots. But I don't think that's what was really happening. I think there are a number of people in this world that really are coming from these higher frequency levels and saying, nope, I'm going to stand with my neighbors because we are connected, we have inherent worth, we have dignity, we're going to name that for ourselves and for our neighbors. And then we have these other people that are still, for whatever reason, are really coming from fear and anger and shame and guilt. And we have some people in leadership that are really good at stoking those lower frequency vibrations. So Albert Einstein said, the solution to a problem is never found with the same thinking that created the problem. And this is so true. So if we want to fix this mess that we are in, we need to come at it from a different perspective than the one that created it. And a few years ago, Michelle Obama, in one of her speeches, said, when they go low, we go high. And looking at this from the level of consciousness, to me, that makes so much sense. And this is exactly what happened in the story I read earlier about the mother who forgave her son's killer. When she said, I am going to kill you, we all assumed that that meant she was coming from that same level of consciousness and was going to exact her revenge. And many of us would think that perhaps that would be justified, that eye for an eye, so to speak. And yet she understood, because she was coming from these higher levels of consciousness and power, she understood that true healing and change would not and could not be had with the same type of thinking that took her son from her. She came from a higher level of consciousness, and as a result, she raised this young man up out of his negative, destructive place he was in. And so I think that this is the key. When we're looking at what is going on in the world, we need to understand that if we have two groups feeding into anger, they simply perpetuate each other. And what we are left with are violent clashes and people going to the hospital and property being destroyed. And in the past 2 weeks, people literally dying. And so what does work, I think, are the people who are willing to, as I've been saying for weeks, stand up and speak up. And what also works are the ministers and the peaceful protesters who calmly and quietly lock arms and stand in defiance of the anger and the hate and the violence. And the people who show up as angels to block the hateful Hillsborough Baptist church groups that show up spewing hate at and protesting at funerals of American soldiers and our LGBTQ community. Because this is not about being weak or not doing anything, but it is about being very clear as to what level of consciousness we're coming from. Because as Hawkins defines it, power comes from within and force comes from without, and power is so much stronger than force. And he writes, the motivation of Mahatma Gandhi, calibrated at 700, was very near the top of the range of the normal human consciousness. Gandhi won his struggle because his position was one of far greater power. The British Empire represented force. And whenever force meets power, force is eventually defeated. He goes on to say, we may observe how throughout history, society has tried to treat social problems by legislative action, warfare, market manipulation, laws, prohibitions, all manifestations of force, only to see that these problems persist or recur despite the treatments. Although governments or individuals proceeding from positions of force are myopic to the sensitive observer, it eventually becomes obvious that conditions of social conflict won't disappear until the underlying origins have been exposed and healed. So, in other words, as Einstein says, you don't solve the problem with the same thinking that created the problem. And so it's time for us to think outside of the box. And I love this example that he gives. I'm going to finish today with this example that he gives of a, quote, bum on the street. He writes, in an upscale neighborhood stands an old man in tattered clothes, alone and leaning against the corner of an elegant brownstone. Look at him from the perspective of various levels of consciousness and note the inconsistency in how he appears to different people and viewpoints. From the bottom of the scale at a level 20, shame, the bum may seem to be dirty, disgusting, and disgraceful. From a level of 30, guilt, he'd be blamed for his condition. He deserves what he gets. He's probably lazy, a welfare cheat. At 50, hopelessness, his plight would appear desperate and a damning piece of evidence to prove that society just can't do anything about this. At 75, grief, the old man looks tragic and forlorn. At a consciousness level of 100, fear, we might see the bum as threatening, a social misfit. Perhaps we should call the police before he commits a crime. At 125, desire, he might represent a frustrating problem. Why doesn't somebody do something? At 150, anger, the old man might look like he could be violent, or on the other hand, one could be furious that such a horrible condition exists in our country. At 175, pride, he could be seen as an embarrassment or lacking in self-respect to better himself. At 200, courage, we might be motivated to wonder if there is a local homeless shelter. All he needs is a job and a place to live. At 250, neutrality, the bum looks okay, maybe even interesting. Live and let live, we might say. After all, he's not hurting anyone. At 310, willingness, we might decide to go down and see what we can do to cheer up the fellow on the corner. Maybe we'd be motivated to volunteer sometime at the local shelter. At 350, acceptance, the man on the corner appears intriguing. He probably has an interesting story to tell. He's where he is for reasons we may never understand. At 400, reason, he's a symptom of the current economic and social malaise, or perhaps a good subject for an in-depth psychological study. At the higher levels, the old man begins to look not only interesting, but friendly, and then lovable. Perhaps we'd then be able to see that he was in fact the one who had transcended social limits and gone free, a joyful old guy with the wisdom of age in his face and the serenity that comes from indifference to material things. At 600 peace, he is revealed as our own self in a temporary expression. I love this example because at each new level of consciousness, nothing externally has changed and everything has changed. And the only thing that has changed is our perspective. And I don't know about all of you, but being able to look at the world through this lens has offered me a sense of hope. It has offered me a new perspective with which I can approach things that I don't understand with new layers of compassion. So is this to say we are to stay silent in the face of injustice? Not at all. It is understanding that the world is not black and white. It's understanding that people are experiencing the world from their unique perspectives, and they are doing the best they can from the paradigm that they are coming from, which allows us to understand a little bit better our own paradigms and how we might contribute to becoming the change we want to see in the world. I've begun to understand that change doesn't happen by becoming angry or hateful or violent. But as the mother in our meditation shows, it might just work as we focus on ourselves and our own levels of vibration. Perhaps we will help other people aspire to move up that scale too. So as we take this in, why don't we take a few minutes and we'll sing Standing on the Side of Love together.
Standing